This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. All you have to do is go to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon, click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we just cannot thank you enough. My guest today is an award-winning American-Israeli writer based at the Leer Jerusalem Institute. His new book, third one, is a biography of the early 20th century Jewish-Polish author and artist entitled Bruno Schulz, An Artist, a Murder, and the Hijacking of History. It was published earlier this year by W.W. Norton. Benjamin Balint, hello and welcome back to the Tel Aviv Review.
It's good to be with you and your listeners, Gilad.
So 4 years ago, you sat here in this studio and discussed your previous book, Kafka's Last Trial, that dealt with the cultural legacy of another Jewish writer, one that Schulz is often compared to. And indeed, your new book is a discussion of Schulz's cultural legacy as much as it is a biography. Is the Schulz book an emanation of the Kafka book?
It's an emanation, I would say, in two senses. One is that I became interested in Schulz via Kafka. Bruno Schulz is often called the Polish Kafka. Kafka wrote in one area of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in German language, and Schulz in another part of the eastern reaches of that empire in the Polish language. He also translated, the first translator of Kafka into Polish was Bruno Schulz. And I became interested in a second way in issues of disputed cultural heritage, which is to say, the afterlife and the ways in which that afterlife is appropriated, especially by nation states. And just as with the case of Kafka, 100 years after his death nearly, there was an international court case about where his manuscripts belong. So too, as we'll discuss, there's a similar contentious scandal, you might say, regarding the last artworks of Bruno Schulz.
Yeah, okay, let's do it now. Tell us, first of all, about the art and literature of Bruno Schulz. And before we get to how they're woven into his life story, how are they woven into each other?
Bruno Schulz was a school teacher from Drohobych in Galicia. It's at that time a part of, as I say, the eastern reaches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Today it's Western Ukraine. His day job was as a school teacher of arts and crafts. But all the while, he was drawing, painting, and writing fiction. He first became nationally known in Poland for his graphic art in the 1920s. And then he published 2 books of fiction and short stories in the 1930s that vaulted him to fame as a master of the Polish language and master of Polish modernism. So in a sense, it's a very rare artist who attains fame, but also a very high level in both of these media, so to speak, in the visual and in the verbal. I would almost say Schulz is kind of like the William Blake of Poland in that sense. And the ways that those two relate to one another are that, in a sense, they're both surrealistic. They both melt away the contours of place and time. They both take narrative tracks that circle upon themselves.
Yeah, as you said, he was often called the Polish Kafka. But then again, there's this sense, at least to me as an observer, that he never reached Kafka's fame. There isn't an adjective named after him, right? There's not a Schulzian phenomena. Anyway, why do you think that is? Is it because he wrote in Polish and not in a bigger language like German?
Yes, I think that in a sense he was working in what sometimes is called a minor language, and his work was only translated posthumously. He had, as it happens, perfect German. He wrote a short story in German. He corresponded with Thomas Mann, but he preferred to write in the Polish language, his native tongue. It is true that he's not as well known internationally as Kafka. I think that may be changing now, but I also think that although there's no real adjective Schulzian in the same way that we commonly speak of the Kafkaesque. I did go in 2020 to his hometown for the Bruno Schulz Festival, which brings what they call themselves Schulzologists, or sometimes Schulzoids, from all over the world, including his Japanese translator, including his English language translators and various scholars. And there is a certain sense in which he's become a kind of cult figure. He's sometimes called a writer's writer because of all of the writers, both in Israel and in the States, who have looked to him as a master.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the writer's writer. So it sometimes places him in a certain, more confined, more esoteric sort of realm where he flourishes and his legacy flourishes. And of course, he is and still remains a very influential writer on other writers. Can you talk a bit about the ripple effects of Schulz's literature on literature written today?
Sure. Well, for one thing, he influenced Isaac Bashevis Singer, who said that Schulz wrote sometimes like Proust, sometimes like Kafka, but often reached depths that neither of them had plumbed. I also had a breakfast earlier this year with Olga Tokarczuk, the Polish Nobel laureate, who said that for her, Schulz is a kind of a god whom she both hates and loves at the same time. Hates because he's such a strong influence that he must be overcome in her own writing. Beyond the confines of Poland, he was admired almost obsessively by Philip Roth, who, as you may know, published a very influential series with Penguin paperbacks called Writers from the Other Europe, and he was the first to bring in Milan Kundera, Danilo Kish, and Bruno Schulz into the English language mainstream, and whose own novella, The Prague Orgy, is based on the Schulz story. He influenced in this country David Grossman's, to my mind, masterpiece, Sea Under Love. The central section of that is a retelling, a reimagination of Bruno Schulz.
Let's talk about the murals that were really the center of the controversy that you discuss in your book and really are, I would say, the mystery part of your story, right? It's a detective story in that sense too. How did you first become acquainted with those murals that were taken from his hometown in Ukraine illegally and brought to Israel and are now have been since then shown at Yad Vashem?
Well, I first met the filmmaker, the German filmmaker based in Hamburg, who, together with his father, and after years of research, rediscovered the location of these murals. And to take one step back, during the Second World War, Bruno Schulz was essentially enslaved by an SS officer from Vienna, whose name was Felix Landau. And in a sense, a Faustian bargain was made. The officer said to Schulz, first of all, Schulz's graphic art caught this officer's eye. He thought of himself as a man of good taste. And he said to Schulz, I'll extend your life, give you certain privileges and rations, and in return for which you'll be my house artist, so to speak. And the last thing that Schulz painted on this kind of, parenthetically, I should say that the whole idea of coerced art began to fascinate me. What does it mean to take that which is most precious to you, your own creative impulse as an artist, and to harness that, to allow that to be enslaved by, in this case, a Nazi officer?
And also the flip side of it, I'm sorry for digressing, but we're going to get back to that in a second. The flip side of it, that the Nazi officer appreciates Bruno Schulz's art so much that he's willing to give him so many privileges that were so rare.
That's right. And in fact, he did extend in this way Bruno Schulz's otherwise short life. And the last thing that the SS officer Landau commanded Schulz to do was to paint murals on the children's room, because this SS officer was so comfortable in his posting in Drohobych that he brought along his two young children, ages 2 and 4, and he commanded Schulz, draw a fairy tale scene. And this is what Schulz did in the spring of 1942. Beautiful depictions of Snow White figures and Hansel and Gretel and a horse and carriage and this kind of thing. At the same time, introducing a subversive element by putting his own face, for example, in the face of the carriage driver. And shortly afterwards, Schulz was killed. And at the end of the war, when Drohobych became incorporated into Ukraine, this particular SS villa was apportioned to Ukrainian apparatchiks and war veterans, and the murals were painted over and considered lost for 60 years. It was a great mystery where these last artworks had resided. And to bring it back finally to your question, I interviewed Benjamin Geisler, a filmmaker who went to Drohobych, discovered the location. It turned out to be in what is now a kitchen pantry. And they got permission from the owners of this apartment to take off the shelves of garlic and of pickles. And they were able to, with a team of conservationists, to take off the outer layers of paint. And lo and behold, the original paintings from 1942 of Bruno Schulz re-emerged in their full, vibrant color. Now, I'll just add one thing, which is that the German filmmaker notified immediately the relevant authorities, including the Minister of Culture of Ukraine, the Minister of Culture of Poland, and representatives of Yad Vashem. This, I think, turned out to be a mistake. This was early 2001, because 3 months later, Yad Vashem, together with the Mossad, sent 3 agents to Drohobych, and assisted by bribes in the 6 figures in dollars, were able to spend the night chiseling out the 5 fragments of these murals of Bruno Schulz, and with the help of then Israeli ambassador to Poland, Shevach Weiss, and his diplomatic immunity, were able to smuggle them out of the country and bring them back to Yad Vashem.
Did you ask him why he notified the Yad Vashem representatives?
Yes, I did. And his own father, Benjamin Geisler's father, served as a Wehrmacht officer. And essentially, they were part of the German generation that wanted to do right. And that's essentially why they notified Yad Vashem. They knew that from the perspective of Yad Vashem, Schulz was a victim of the Shoah, and they ought to be notified of this find.
Its discovery in 2001 was a big deal, an international news story. Was it then that Bruno Schulz was really catapulted into international attention again?
Yes, as I say, his works were catapulted back into, and his fictions were catapulted into attention far before that, by people like Philip Roth, by people like Cynthia Ozick, who also wrote a Bruno Schulz novel called The Messiah of Stockholm. So in literary circles, he was known. But this really catapulted the attention on his artistic and graphic work back into the spotlight. It's also true that the Ukrainians themselves started to care more about Bruno Schulz after this rediscovery, and in particular after the Yad Vashem smuggling operation, much more so than they had before. And it's actually the Bruno Schulz festival that I attended was a direct result of certain Ukrainian scholars who said, no, Bruno Schulz is ours, and we want a festival here on his native soil to attest to the former multi-ethnic tapestry that Drohobych was until the war.
If they hadn't been smuggled by Israel, what do you think would have turned out of these murals?
There were plans immediately after the discovery to make a kind of Bruno Schulz museum at that very site. As I say, there were only 3 months for these plans to develop. And today, the remaining murals, because the Israelis took out 5 fragments, but there are other fragments that remained on the walls, were themselves removed by the Ukrainian officials. And today I saw them in Drohobych City Museum. So I think they would have been displayed in some sense, perhaps in greater unity and harmony than they are today.
Yeah. Was there any battle of authority between Ukraine and Poland over them, over Schulz in general?
It was clear that Drohobych being territorially in Ukraine, that the murals belonged to Ukrainian culture. What I did understand in my trips to Poland is that Schulz is considered for his language alone a master of Polish literature that high school students read today. And that plays to a difference between the graphic works and the fictions, especially in the sense of transportability. Literature is transportable in a way that paintings, murals, or drawings are not, in the sense that literature can be transnational, and that's one of the things I try to bring out in my book, in a way that, let's say, physical artifacts, which can be treated as relics, must be geographically defined somehow. That was the case with Kafka's manuscripts, and that was the case with Schulz's murals.
Yeah, but then again, the fact that the language aspect here brings another dimension, and that turns the Schulz saga into a trinational one, as opposed to Kafka, that was just a battle between Israel and Germany over whether Kafka was more Jewish or more German. I mean, in Schulz's case, there's the geographical location that makes him Ukrainian. There's the, say, cultural role that he played mainly in his literature that makes him Polish. And of course, there's his biographical identity that makes him Jewish. In a sense, literature is simpler than art.
I would say that as well. And I must quote something that Schulz himself wrote, which is to paraphrase, he said, I'm an Austrian, a Pole, and a Jew all in the space of an afternoon. He was also under the Soviet regime for a short while during the war. He was, of course, under the Third Reich. He never moved. Drohobych was someplace that he felt extremely attached to. It was the very backdrop of both of his artistic and his literary efforts. He lived his entire life there. And yet, staying in one geographical place, he was a citizen of these four regimes.
Why did Mossad even smuggle it in the first place? Why didn't it do it properly, via some sort of cultural relations between two countries?
Yes, you asked the obvious question. I don't have a good answer for that. I will say that perhaps there was an element of time. I think that the operation was rushed. And in the end, the negotiations, this may be characteristic of the Israeli way of doing things from the Eichmann abduction on down to Schulz, which is act first and negotiate second. In the end, there were 8 years of negotiations between Israeli and Ukrainian representatives. Only after, in the meantime, during those 8 years, Israel was not legally able to display these murals. They were sitting in a basement storage in Yad Vashem. And only in 2009, after signing a cultural agreement with the Ukrainians, was Yad Vashem able to display them publicly for the first time. I should say that David Grossman was honored by speaking at the opening, and one of the first visitors to see them after they were publicly displayed was then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who was brought by then Chief Rabbi Lau to see the Schulz murals.
I want to go back to Schulz's life because the story of his murder is also quite interesting.
That's right. It was, in a sense, I found in my archival work at least 5 versions of the shooting of Schulz. What is clear is that he was going out to get his daily ration of bread, probably to bring it back to his family, at the time of a Gestapo action and in retaliation for another Jewish resident of Drohobych who had injured a Gestapo officer. And it was it was called Black Thursday, November 19th, 1942. And it was sort of an open hunting season on Jews. He happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. In the most common account, and in a sense the most tragic, officer who shot him was a rival of every SS officer had their pets, and there was one who was named Günther, and he had a pet or an enslaved Jewish dentist, and apparently Felix Landau was responsible for killing that dentist. So Günther shoots Schulz down on the street, and that afternoon says over lunch to Felix Landau, "You shot my Jew, I just shot yours."
Is there any symbolism in that murder? Does it tie into his life story, into his art, into his literature in any way?
I resisted the temptation to read the life retrospectively through the death, especially since the stories of his death were so powerful. There's a tendency to read the legend of Bruno Schulz through that death. And I tried very hard to resist that because, of course, his life was not fated to end in this way. By the way, he was only 50 years old when he was killed. So I do try to give respect to giving enough space for the creativity that he displayed in his life and not to read it too much through the symbolism of his death.
Did he have a family? Does he have any legal heirs who were in one way or another involved in this whole legal case?
Bruno Schulz never had children. There were some commonalities, not just in the literature, but in the lifestyles of Bruno Schulz and Franz Kafka. Both of them were engaged. Both of them broke the engagement. Both of them had a certain inner resistance to matrimonial ties. So Bruno Schulz, like Franz Kafka, never had children. He did, however, have nephews and nieces, and a grandnephew named Jacob Schulz made it out and was living in London, and I interviewed people until the 1990s, and I interviewed people who knew Jacob or Jakob Schulz quite well.
Mm-hmm. So there's really no family involvement.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Going back to comparing these two cases, again, Kafka and Schulz, what can you tell us about the similarities and differences between, now that you've studied both so thoroughly, what have you learned from both about, the importance of cultural legacy? I
would say that in their literary styles, they are extremely different. Kafka is very pared down almost to the steel essence of the German language, whereas Schulz's language, which I recommend to all of your listeners to read for themselves, is wildly and vividly colorful and with long, sensuous, snake-like sentences. On another level, I did discover a certain similarity or affinity with their own relation to belonging. by which I mean Kafka famously said, "What do I have in common with the Jews? I have hardly anything in common with myself." He resisted his best friend Max Brod's invitations to draw him into the Zionist fold. And in a certain sense, I found the same thing with Bruno Schulz, that he was, on the one hand, proudly a Jew, on the other hand, didn't want to be defined too much by his Jewishness. In both cases, as I write in the book, their artwork represents a certain impossibility of belonging. And that's one of the great ironies, that so many decades after the death of these two writers and artists, that others would make national claims on two people who themselves were so aware of the impossibility of belonging. I just want to add one last line to that thought, which is that in a certain sense, Schulz, I conclude in the book, really felt nowhere at home. But precisely because of that, he's everywhere at home. He's been translated into 40 languages now. There's a certain sense in which, precisely because he felt nowhere at home, neither as fully a Pole nor as fully a Jew, and by the way, he was quite eviscerated by Polish nationalist right-wing critics during his lifetime, didn't have an easy time of it. Precisely because of that, it's so ironic that all these decades later, there are these national claims being made of how to appropriate their legacies for reasons of legitimacy.
But there's a major difference between Schulz and Kafka. I think it's just in the sense of the years in which they lived. I mean, whereas Kafka had the privilege of belonging to this big multinational empire and therefore be quote-unquote, quote, culturally rootless in that sense. Schulz lived well into Polish nationalism and then the Nazi occupation and the Second World War, again, escaping the Shoah narrowly. He, especially towards the end of his life, did not have the privilege of reneging on his Jewishness in that sense.
That's right. He was defined by others, you might say, both at the end of his life and in 2001.
So his resistance was more active to that definition by others?
Yes, he took an active, and I think that's part of his inner freedom. And if you read Schulz and if you look at his artworks, there's a terrific sense of inner freedom. And that's why it's so tragic that his artistic sensibilities were enslaved. Yeah, there is a sense of absolute inner freedom and resistance of these external claims.
Going back to, I think it was the first question I asked you today, or maybe the second. In what way do you think your book benefited from telling the whole story of Schulz's life, as opposed to just the tail end of it, and that is the controversy over the murals and the cultural legacy?
This is a man who was a genius, and his genius ripened before the Second World War was even on the horizon. It was important to me not only to depict the life of Schulz and his creativity, but also through him, the tapestry of what was an incredibly vibrant cultural scene in this part of Galicia. Remember this, within only a few dozen miles of each other, there's Bruno Schulz writing in Polish, there's Agnon writing in Hebrew, and there's Josef Roth writing in German. These three late flowerings of European modernism, each in their own languages, but each coming from the same region. Drohobych was itself often referred to as 1.5 cities because it felt like there were half of its population at any given time was Jewish, half Polish and half Ukrainian. They got along quite well. And this is a multi-ethnic tapestry that has since been lost, both in Ukraine and in Poland, both linguistically and ethnically. So it was an important mission of mine to revive a sense of that rich linguistic porousness that existed and that was so tragically cut short in the Second World War.
And all of this is in the wonderful book, Bruno Schulz, An Artist, a Murder, and the Hijacking of History by Benjamin Balint. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Gilad. It's a pleasure.
And also many thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. Most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review when Yael, my co-host, will be back. And until then, from me here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.